Welcome to the 8th grade Math Homework Helper Series. Tonight's homework is PR4, Finding Unit Rates Based on Proportional Graphs. We'll start by taking a look at question number 1. For numbers 1 through 4, you're going to be using the graph and the table to find the unit rate, the slope, or m, and also to write an equation for the proportional relationship. We'll start by taking a look at the graph. The graph states that there's a teacher-student ratio for field trips, and on the y-axis is the number of students, on the x-axis is the number of teachers. And we need to find a slope. So the first thing we want to do for step 1 is choose a point on the graph that's easy to read. Now I've chosen 2, 16. It looks like it lines up pretty nicely, so it's an estimate, but I think we're pretty accurate on that. If I have to once I have the coordinates, I can set it up y over x, which gives me 16 over 2, 16 being the number of students, 2 being the number of teachers. Now, focusing on the 16 and the 2, I'm going to divide y by x, 16 by 2, and that gives me 8, or 8 over 1, as my slope. So I have 8 as my number of students, 1 as my number of teachers. So, using the slope, I can then go ahead and insert that into an equation, y equals mx. So, the equation I have is y equals 8x. And now that I've solved my graph, which is an estimate, it may or may not match up with what I have over here on my table. I'm going to work on my table. So, following the steps, the first thing I want to do is assign the first column as an x and the second column as y. So I have x over my teacher data and y over my student data. So now that I've done that, I'm going to take the second ratio, and generally that's the ratio that I work with, because the first one is always 0, 0, because these all pass through the origin, and that doesn't help me much for an equation, or finding the slope. So I'm going to work with 216, and I'm going to set it up as y over x, noting that my 16 is in my y, and my 2 is in my x. So just like the graph before, I have 16 over 2, 16 being the number of students, 2 being the number of teachers. Now, the fact that this matches up with my graph before tells me that my estimate was very accurate. And sometimes that'll happen, but not often. Okay, so because this is exactly the same as the estimate that I had, my information is going to work out to be exactly the same. It's going to reduce down to 8 over 1, 8 being the number of students, 1 being the number of teachers, and the equation that I come up with is going to be exactly the same. If I use the y equals mx formula, I'm going to have y equals 8x. All right, let's take a look at another. For this one, I want to take a look at number 4. Again, we'll take a look at the graph first. So, on the graph, we have price of 10,000 gold ounces. Okay, so we have the price on the y-axis and the ounces of gold on the x-axis. And I need to find a slope. So just like before, I need to find a point on this graph that seems relatively easy to read. I'm going to choose 2 and 400. It's not exact, but I think it's pretty close. So if I choose 2 and 400 with my y and my x, the 2 is on the x-axis, so that goes down below. The 400 is coming off the y-axis, so it goes on top. My 400 represents dollars. My 2 represents ounces. If I divide these out, I wind up with 200 over 1, or just 200. The 200 still being dollars, and the bottom number 1 still being ounces. So this is my slope. 200 basically is my slope. And I can put that into the equation, y equals mx, as y equals 200x. Let's keep that equation and slope in mind as we now work with the more accurate graph. So let's slide out the information for the graph. Again, step 1 for the table. So step 1 for the table is assign the first column x and the second y. So there's my x, ounces of gold, my y, the price. Take the second ratio, which happens to be $649.26 for 3 ounces of gold, and set it up as y over x. So we have $649.26 over 3 ounces. And I could use a calculator, whatever, to divide that. And what you're going to find is you get $216.42 over 1 ounce. So 216.42 is my actual slope. Looking back at this graph, we had 200 as our estimated slope. So that's pretty accurate, actually. We were only $16.42 off. So I can take this information and insert it into the equation formula, which is y equals mx. So my formula is y equals 216.42x. Okay, now we're going to take a look at question number 8. And questions 5 through 8 actually are different than the first 4. For these, we're going to find the rate of change, which is exactly what we did before. That's finding the slope, so that's no different. We're going to write an equation. That's no different than what we did before. So we're also going to do that. The one thing that is different is you are going to use the equation that we come up with in B to find y, and we're going to assign x a value of 100. So, all right, let's work this out one step at a time. So the graph we're looking at is cars owned by families. Our y information is number of cars. Our x data is number of families. So to determine the rate of change, I need to pick a point, and I'm going to pick this point right here. So I'm saying it's 2, 6. That looks pretty accurate, actually. It looks like it lines up pretty nicely. So to solve A, I need to take my x and y information and line it up with y over x. So that gives me 6 over 2, 6 being the number of cars, 2 being the number of families. I can then reduce that to 3 over 1. 3 being the number of cars still, 1 being the number of families still. So the rate of change, or the slope, is 3 over 1. And I could write that in for rate of change. The equation. Well, now that I know the slope, I'm going to take the y equals mx formula and stick the slope of 3 that I got as y equals 3x. The value of y. If I take the formula I had before, which is y equals 3x, and substitute 100 for x, I get y equals 3 times 100. Solving that out, I get y equals 300. Pulling that back in, if y is 300 and my y-axis talks about cars, that's saying that, and 100 was x, and the x-axis talks about families, 100 for every 100 families, you're going to have 300 cars. And that would be the value of y. Okay, use these problems that I've solved for you to answer the additional problems that are on your homework. Remember, the key to success in math is not only working hard, but working smart.